coming here this afternoon, I caught the light rail from Lee, and sitting opposite me in the light rail were three young Indonesian men chattering away, and I knew, because I speak the language, I knew that what they were talking about, but I thought, well, that's an omen for today, I think. I also thought how back in 1942, people would have been amazed to see these people and hear these people had there been a light rail. But now, with the great mixture of cultures and ethnicities we have here, nobody batted an eyelid, but I did, because I could hear what they were hear them speaking, so I thought that was a good omen. As Donald has mentioned, before World War II, there was very little understanding or knowledge of the Netherlands East Indies, particularly the Indonesian population and Australia. Probably the first Indonesians to ever come to this country was before white settlement, when, is that this? When fishermen from what is now Sulawesi came to Australia fishing for something called trepang or beche de mer or sea cucumber. They had interactions, they came to Arnhem Land, came down on big sailing ships. They had interactions with the indigenous people there. Some of the indigenous people went back to Sulawesi with them. They continue to, and there are descendants on both sides from Sulawesi and here of those unions that happened way back before white settlement. After white settlement, the only two groups of people that I've been able to find that were here there was some Javanese indentured workers in the Queensland cane industry. I don't think we know about the South Sea Islanders, but not too much about Javanese being here. And in the pearling industry, there are also people from what is now part of Indonesia who were working on the pearling ships. So that's Indonesians coming here. Also, before World War II, as Donald mentioned, there were a few adventurous Australians who went to the Indies. The Dutch East Indies government set up a Java-Australia line for cruise ships to go back and forth, mostly that way, with Australians going to have holidays, not in Bali in those days, but in Java. And there was also a major trade mission went from Australia to engage with the Netherlands Indies government, trying to set up trade connections. I'll just read a little bit here of the impression that one of the people on that trade mission was called the Goodwill Mission. This is his opinion of how he interpreted the relationship between the Netherlands Indies Dutch and the local people. Their world has been made for them by generous nature, assisted ably by the methodical and omniscient Dutch administration. For these obedient, tractable little brown men have been assembled bright skies, blue seas, all the complexities and burdens of government they allow to rest on the broad shoulders of their Dutch overlords. The brown man is aware that always the superior power is his refuge and guide. That was in 1933. Little did those people know that from 1920 onwards, there was a burgeoning nationalist movement growing in Indonesia. All sorts of different ideologies about how independence should be achieved, but with a common goal that eventually they would be able to throw off the colonial rule. And so I thought that was really funny that he said that at the same time that this fermentation is going on, particularly in Sumatra and Java. Okay, so 1942, and we can have our first one next, Pete. This is from a Dutch, a Netherlands Indies newspaper at the time, where the Japanese are invading the Netherlands East Indies, and it's a matter of time before they eventually, as we know, they defeat the Indies, but this is getting ready for its hour, the Netherlands Empire. We were allies of the Dutch in Europe, of course, so that made us allies of the Netherlands Indies people. Okay, the next one, thanks, Pete. So, who came to Australia? On the Dutch side, there were civilians, there was an administration centred in Melbourne that looked after all affairs. There was an information service that fed propaganda and whatever they wanted to the Indonesians and to the Dutch people here. And then there were various, as far as on the Indonesian, there were also civilian refugees, Dutch civilian refugees. So we had a large contingent of Netherlands, Indies, Dutch people here. And then as far as the Indonesian people, the people we now call Indonesians, there were members of the Dutch, the Netherlands, Indies forces, some military, some air force. There were, who else, let's see, there were civilians working for the Indonesian administration. There were servants of some of the Dutch families, and a lot of merchant sailors, because Dutch ships were being used, for example, to bring wounded people, wounded soldiers back from Europe to Australia. There's a large merchant shipping fleet of Dutch ships in Australia at the time. So they were that, civilian servants, members of the armed forces, merchant sailors. That was the composition of the Indonesian people. They were spread in different parts of Australia, country towns and cities, particularly Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And this is just some of the Indonesian troops arriving. I think we all know about the Americans here during the war, but I guess not a lot of people would know that there were actually Indonesian servicemen here too. Go to the next one, thanks, Pete. This is from, that was called the Netherlands East Indies 18th Squadron in Batchelor in the Northern Territory. As you can see, it's a mixture of Aussies, Dutch and Indonesians. This fellow and this fellow, his name's Jardi, his name's Jim. When I was doing this, researching this book, I wrote to Indonesian and Australian newspapers, told them what I was doing and asked if anyone had been involved, would they contact me. So I had some wonderful experiences talking to the now elderly Indonesians and elderly Australians who'd had relationships during the war. So this is just one of an example. These two became close friends, despite the fact that the Australians were told not to mix with the natives. This fellow ignored that. And could we have the next one? This is them. And many years later, after the war, that's Jardi, that's Jim. Jim went back to Indonesia to find Jardi and they found each other. So that's them years later. I love that sort of thing. I love that story. Okay. So they're all settling in. We had Indonesian servicemen in Casino. If any of you know Casino, the north coast town. There was a large contingent of people in Casino. The Dutch established hostels for the merchant seamen. There was one in Melbourne called Indonesia House. In Sydney there was the hotel called the Belvedere in King's Cross, which was taken over by the Dutch. There was another establishment in North Sydney called the Lido. So there were merchant seamen scattered around the place when they're not on ships. And all of these folks are now mingling in Australian society. They're not locked up. They can go and start to experience life in a very different situation from what they're used to. Okay, so the first action, I suppose, against the Dutch by Indonesians in Australia back in those days was in about 1943, so all these merchant ships are in Australia and they're from different parts of the world, and the Indonesian merchant seamen were treated very poorly compared to merchant sailors from other nationalities. They were poorly paid, they were poorly accommodated, they were poorly fed, and the Australian maritime unions were on the wharves looking at all these situations, and they were sort of speaking to the merchant sailors here, hey, this is not too good, you should do something about it. So there was a hospital ship called the Orange. I don't know whether that's the right Dutch pronunciation, probably Oranje or something like that. Can you remember? Orange, anyway. That was a hospital ship, and the first strike, the first action, contrary to Dutch will, was when merchant sailors on that ship walked off the ship, refused to be there, refused to have anything to do with sailing it or doing anything. Thereby they became prohibited immigrants according to Australia's White Australia policy. So, which I guess we all know what that is, don't we? Do I need to talk about that from 19? So these chaps were first of all sent to Long Bay Jail, which suddenly couldn't accommodate them all, there were so many, and it was decided to send about 800 of them to Cowra in the, I think it's southwest, New South Wales, where there was, as we know, a prisoner of war camp. And so these sailors, although they weren't prisoners of war, they were sent there to sort of cool their heels, and they were given the opportunity to be released if they'd agreed to go back onto the ship. And then if they weren't, they were eventually conscripted into what was called the 36th Australian Employment Company. They were forced labourers, in fact, working for the war effort in different ways. Whenever physical muscle was required for example, there was a detachment of them in a little town called Wollongara. Wollongara is a tiny blink and you'll miss it town that's on the border of New South Wales and Queensland, and it really is blink and you'll miss it. Can I tell them the story about my uncle at this stage? I will. Anyway, I've got a lot of things to say, but I had an uncle who lived in Wollongara, and I met him many years, a few years back later. He said, "Well, what are you doing, dear?" And I said, "Well, I'm teaching Indonesian at Sydney University." He said, "Oh, Indonesian. Is that anything to do with the Javos?" And I said, "Well, do you mean people from Java?" And he said, yeah, people from Java, Javos. And I said, "Well, yes, Java is, a very important island in Indonesia." He said, "Oh, yeah, we had Javos in Wollongara during the war." And I thought, what? Javanese in little old Wollongara? In fact, that's what started me off on this whole project, Uncle Gordon's comment. So that was one of the camps. There was some in Toowoomba, Blackbutt, various places in Queensland. Okay, so we've got the merchant sailors on strike, we've got the people scattered all over the country. Now can we just have the next one? The first boat people by that name were a group of Indonesians. This is in about 1940, early 1943. There was a boatload of Javanese people in Sumatra. The men were fitters and turners, so they were skilled tradesmen, and the Dutch wanted them to come back to Java to sort of help make munitions or whatever, if that's what fitters and turners do. I suppose they help in that sort of thing. On the way, the war escalated, and so they came south and landed first in Fremantle, where Dutch authorities sort of said, "Oh, what's going on here?" And then they sent them round to Melbourne. So they arrived in Melbourne, and courtesy of a Methodist minister called the Reverend Freeman and his family, they accommodated these people. They accommodated them in the church hall, made sleeping quarters for the men, the women, the kids, and again meeting the Freeman's daughters when I interviewed the Freeman's daughters, and they were talking about what a wonderful time they had with these people, and they were very proudly speaking some Indonesian to me that they had learnt back in the 40s and still remembered. So this is just settling into life in Melbourne for these families, kids at school, things people. The caption with this was the incredible sight these people made walking down the street in Melbourne. You can imagine it, can't you? In the 40s, wouldn't have seemed much like that. And a bit of a sing-song here. So that was the boat people of Melbourne. Okay. Oh yeah, this is another wonderful. These people were this fellow here, George. This is George as a young man, and this is George when I met him. He was he was a serviceman, and he had a wonderful time in Australia. First of all, he was in Melbourne, then Sydney, and then Casino, and he learnt skills like throwing a boomerang, learning English, surfing, going to AFL matches, when he talked to me about all these things. And when I met him there, years later in Bandung in Java, he was blind and depressed. And he was sitting in a room all by himself in the house. And I came to do the interview with him. The whole family sort of sat around, and George and I started speaking in Indonesian, and he started to tell his story. And the family were all just gobsmacked. Oh my God, because he never talked about all these exciting things. And then at the end of the interview, when, you know, I'd finished everything, I was sitting next to him, and he suddenly said in English, "Jan, do you know Lily Marlene?" So, yes, George. So we sang Lily Marlene. And then we sang Now Is the Hour. He knew those in English. But then the finale was, "Jan, you know Hokey Pokey?" Yes. So I got George up by the hand, and we were dancing around the kid's house doing the hokey pokey, especially like this bit, you know. Everyone just laughed. Anyway, that's my people-to-people stuff. Okay, thank you. Right. As Donald has alluded to, there were another group of people who came to Australia. As I mentioned before, during the 1920s, there were various uprisings by the growing nationalist movement in Indonesia. There were rebellions and some armed activity. The Dutch were very harsh in their treatment of these rebels. They executed the leaders of different uprisings, and then they decided to isolate or exile most of the prominent members of that they could find, any of the resistance, to Dutch New Guinea, into a jungle camp that the people there had to make themselves, build themselves with a bit of Dutch equipment thrown in. They exiled men, women and children. So most of the rebels were males, but not all of them. There were plenty of women in the nationalist movement as well. But because they were going to be there indefinitely, they were allowed to take their families with them. So that sort of exile started in about the 1925, and by the time that Donald's alluded to, 1943, there were probably about 350 of them still there. So if they were rehabilitated and promised to be good, they were allowed to go back to Java, but by about June 1943, there were still about 350 people still there. By that time, the Japanese were sweeping through the Indies, and the Allied concern, particularly with Lord Mountbatten, were concerned that if the Japanese got to this camp in Dutch New Guinea, the people there might collaborate with the Japanese, with the Japanese, and might spill secret. How they could do that after they'd been locked up in the jungle for 20 years, I don't know. But that was the rationale, and the Australian government was contacted and told that these people were going to be, and we had to do what Mountbatten said. He was the commander of the forces at the time, the South Pacific, and so without much thought about where to send these folks to, it was decided that because there'd been some Indonesian merchant sailors previously in Cowra was in the top of the mine, and so let's put them in Cowra. By that time, all the merchant sailors had gone. So, on a first of all, they were brought by Catalina flying planes to, all planes fly, don't they? By Catalina planes to Horn Island. From there, they were transferred to a ship, brought to Brisbane. They had no idea what was happening, where they were going. In Brisbane, they were taken to a big field where obviously people had donated clothing, probably, binnies and all sorts of people, all sorts of clothing, because they had sarongs and jungle kind of clothing, nothing for cold weather. So they grabbed what odds and ends they could, and then they were put on a train in Brisbane for the trip to Cowra. They arrived in Cowra in the middle of winter, and they have black frosts in Cowra. It was terribly, terribly cold, and the poor folks didn't know how to cope with that. This is just some photographs taken within the camp. So you can see they organised a school for the kids, and this lady here is one of my people that I'm going to talk about now. Her name is Siti Kamsina, and she went to the camp in New Guinea when she was about 2, because her father was in the revolution. He was a nationalist. So she grew up there and was about 17 when she came to Australia. I'll explain the circumstances of why they left Cowra in a minute, but while she's here, when they did leave Cowra, the young women were sent to Melbourne to train as nursing aides. And when they graduated, they were told they were going to be sent to parts of Dutch New Guinea to help look after Dutch soldiers. And they refused because they wouldn't have been, it was the Dutch government that sent them here, exiled them, put them in the jungle, and they were expected to go back and look after the Dutch, any wounded soldiers. So they refused to do that, and then I'll tell you what happened to her in a minute. This is when I met her, when she came to Australia. I met her first in Jakarta, and then she came to Australia. So we'll go to the next shot. Oh yeah, okay. So they're in Cowra, and because of perhaps pre-existing illnesses acquired in the jungle and the cold that they encountered in Cowra, a number of the Indonesian people there died, including children. I got wind of this. I knew that they had died, and I won't go into all the details, but I found the graves of these Indonesians. So, of course, when they were buried, they all had a wooden name, piece of board with a name on it. But by the time I found it, back in the 1990s, that had all rotted, and I knew who was in each grave, but I didn't know, without the names, it was hard. I knew the chronological order of the deaths. Anyway, fortunately, there was one headstone, and I went to the local stonemason, and he told me that after the war, the son of that lady who was in that grave came to Cowra and had a headstone made for his mother. And by knowing that name and the date of her death, I was able to identify them all. Now in Indonesia, they really revere what they call pahlawan kemerdekaan, heroes of the revolution. And every year they have a Heroes' Day with a ceremony. So I thought these people were heroes of the revolution. So I went to the Indonesian ambassador in Canberra, told them about these graves. They came and had a look, and then the Department of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia paid with the Cowra Council they're the graves now. So you can see that they've been beautifully restored. All the names are there, and they have a ceremony there every year. Anyway, that's Cowra. Indonesian, the Cowra people, when they were released, so they were the creme de la creme of the nationalists. They were the political people. And when they were released from Cowra, they spoke to different parts of the Indonesian community here and started to politicise them. There hadn't been much political stuff so far. We're talking about the soldiers and the merchant people, merchant sailors.
Why were they released? Sorry.
That's right. Thank you for saying that. They were released because it was an illegal. They were held illegally. They were political prisoners of a foreign nation being held on our soil, and although they were not supposed to have any contact with the local community, there were people who were getting to know about this. That there were sympathetic guards in the Cowra, in that camp. There were also, word gets out, and there was strong support for them by the Communist Party of Australia and by the Civil Liberties Union. And also, in those days, if there was a camp of any kind, there was always what was called the Red Cross visitor. The Red Cross visitor would come and make sure everybody was being treated well. And these, the nationalists in camp They wrote petitions, they described their situation, they pointed out to the Australian government that they were not prisoners of war. They were not at war with Australia, and eventually this matter was taken with all these pressure groups to the government, and a legal ruling was made that they were being held in this camp illegally and should be released immediately. So a lot of the men were sent to Queensland, to these labour force that I told you about before, the employment company. Some of them went to Melbourne and worked for the Dutch administration on the surface, but they were trying to get information that might be helpful for their cause, etc. All the families, including my friend City there that I showed you before, the nurse, they were all sent to Mackay in Queensland, where the climate was much more sympathetic to them too, after the horrible cold of Howrah. So they're in the nationalists are now scattered through the Indonesian communities here, and they're starting to talk about nationalism, about freedom, about the things that they were actually sent here for promoting. So on release, there were a number of different kinds of organisations reflecting the ideologies of the nationalists, the way they wanted to see the future, the way they wanted to see any relationship with the Dutch. Some wanted nothing to do with the Dutch, some were prepared to sort of negotiate certain cooperation. The main establishments, though, were something called independence committees. So there were independence committees run by these nationalists, these former Cowra people, in Brisbane, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. The central one was in Queensland, that's where the main leaders were. And so they started campaigns to try to promote the idea of an independent Indonesia. There was also, I might add, an Australian group. So in Sydney there'd been a club called the Indonesia Club, and a lot of people went there to socialise and dance and whatever and meet each other. All over the place there were interactions on a people-to-people level. In every one of these situations I've described, there were people-to-people learning about each other, having fun, going to Indonesian cultural displays of dancing and all sorts of things going on. You can't imagine it back in the 40s, at least I can't. Anyway, there was a woman who was in that club who was absolutely enthralled by the whole situation, but she was also aware, she was aware of the political situations. Her name was Molly Warner. Eventually she was married, and she married this guy here and became Molly Bonden, and she was an incredible worker for the Indonesian government for her whole life after the war, after she married him and went to Indonesia. But she was responsible for the formation of an organisation called the Australia-Indonesia Association, which started there in Sydney and there are still branches now around the country. There's one in Sydney that I go to occasionally, and those bonds were very strong. And at first they had a social raison d'etre, but then once the political side of things became more apparent, they became politicised as well, promoting the Indonesian cause. So, on 17th of August 1945, the Japanese surrendered, and Sukarno, who was the leader of the nationalists in Indonesia, unilaterally proclaimed independence from the Dutch. During the war, during the Japanese occupation, the nationalist strategy was that Sukarno and his number two, a man called Hatta, would appear to be cooperating with the Japanese, while other nationalists were working underground. So through appearing to cooperate with the Japanese, who wanted to set up something called the Great East Asia Prosperity Sphere, where they'd be the kingpins and all the other Asian races would be subservient to them, but theoretically independent. By working like that, he was able to go to plenty of meetings. He was able to talk to Indonesian people in Indonesia, trying, allegedly, theoretically persuading them that it was a great thing that they could be part of the Japanese great prosperity sphere. But because he was speaking in Indonesian and not a lot of the Japanese understood that, he was able to give all sorts of other messages. Listen, we're not going to put up with this lot. We're going to be independent. So that's the way he was working. So Japanese are defeated. Sukarno declares Indonesia a republic, and then everything started happening here in Australia. People were out on the street. Indonesians started rebelling against the Dutch here because they said, "You've got no authority over us. We are not part of your empire anymore. We are independent." Can we go back to that previous one?
Sure.
Sorry. Just one thing of the avoid here. Some Australian women married Indonesians. Now this was unheard of in those days. You can imagine it. There were about 30 or 40. We know about American war brides, but we don't know much about Indonesian war brides. So this is a couple of them. This lady here, I met her. Just remember her. Her name's Sheila, so I'll come back to Sheila. Good name for an Aussie girl. So that Sheila is someone I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, thank you. So once independence was declared, there were a lot of supporters here in this country, and that's just a bit of a collage of some of the headlines of the day. On the whole, the press, and particularly the Menzies, Mr. Menzies, who was not the Prime Minister then, Chifley was the Prime Minister, were anti-Indonesia, or pro-Dutch, shall we say. But gradually there were a lot of support among the Australian people, and anyway, there's just, there were demos of one kind or another, and we can just see that that's just some of the demonstrations. Of course, when the war finished, what the Dutch really thought was that they would go back to Indonesia and everything would be just as it was before. They had been there since the early 17th century. They'd been there for 350 years and had exploited the natural resources and the labour of the Indies for years, and they thought, we're going back again. It'll all carry on as, and they got a hell of a shock when they suddenly realised that there were people opposed to that idea. So by this time, with so many Indonesians running around, merchant seamen and so on, the war was over. There was no reason for them to still be in Australia. And of course, the government with White Australia and so on wanted to get them back to Indonesia as quickly as possible. So the first repatriation took place in October 1945. And the Australian government, by that time, by the way, in Indonesia itself, there was already fighting and conflict between the Republicans and the Netherlands Indies people. Sukarno left Jakarta, which was then called Batavia, and set up his Republican organisation in a town called Yogyakarta, which is in central Java. A lot of the Republican forces were there. Of course, they weren't as well equipped to fight as the Dutch were. One of their weapons was a sharpened bamboo spear, which has become a sort of a motif representing the rebellion, the rebels, the nationalists. So Sukarno was in central Java with his people. The Australian press were the only sympathetic one was Tribune, as you might imagine, because the communist wharfies were very much involved in the whole resistance here. And Menzies was always criticising Sukarno, always calling him a quisling of the Japanese, so how could we possibly be supporting him? The biggest pro-Indonesian activities here, though, were the black bands that the maritime workers put on all the Dutch ships. So first of all, Indonesians walked off the ships here, and then the Maritime Workers Union, the Wharf Labourers Union, all put a black band on anything to do with Dutch shipping. It was found that some of the Dutch ships had arms, taking them to Indonesia to help with the fight against the Republicans. So when the first ships, people walked off the ships in 1945, for the next 4 years, those bans applied on all Dutch shipping in Australia. It attracted the attention of wharf labourers' unions on other parts of the world, and soon there were bans on ships, New Zealand, India, all sorts of places where people having sympathy for the Indonesian cause also banned ships. Eventually, after 4 years of terrible conflict in Indonesia itself, there would be a treaty agreement between the Dutch forces and the rebellious Indonesians, and the Dutch would break the treaty. There was terrible violence. Thousands of Indonesians were killed by the Dutch in that fight. Eventually, however, world opinion turned against the Dutch because they just called it a police action, but people knew that they were actually trying to eliminate any kind of resistance, and gradually world opinion swung the way of the Indonesian Republic. The United Nations set up what was called a good something committee, I forget the word now. Doesn't matter. Australia represented Indonesia. It was to negotiate some sort of an end to the conflict. Australia was asked to represent Indonesia. Belgium was asked to represent Holland, and those two invited the United States. They needed a third member. So that good officers committee, I think it was, recommended to the United Nations that Indonesia should become a republic, an independent republic. And after 4 years of resistance, but with world opinion turning against them, the Dutch finally capitulated. And in 1949, 4 years after the unilateral declaration of independence by Sukarno, Queen Wilhelmina handed a piece of paper to Sukarno, and Indonesia was now a free country. So just to finish, Sukarno had been in, as I said, in Central Java. He then came back to Jakarta for the first time for 4 years. And this is a really historic photo because it was taken by, remember I told you about Sheila? So Sheila, her husband was in one of the high-ranking people in the Sukarno establishment, and they were there at the airport in Jakarta to meet Sukarno when he came back to take up his position as President of the Republic. And Sheila took that photo, and I'm just so tickled pink to have it. She gave it to me, and so can we have a bit more? So there he is arriving. Here is a ceremony with the Dutch flag coming down and the Indonesian flag being raised. Does anyone know what colour the Indonesian flag is? Red and white, yeah, thank you. Thank you, children. Okay, next one. The next day there was a huge parade in Jakarta, and we can't see it here, but there's Sukarno, and does anyone know who that gentleman is? Pandit Nehru. So the Indian seamen and Chinese seamen in Australia were all very supportive of the Indonesians. So, because the Indian people were also getting independence from the British around about this time. So he was there next to Sukarno for this wonderful victory parade, I suppose you'd call it. So that's the story, and I'm gabbling here, but there are just a couple of funny ones to finish with. Robert Menzies, who had been so anti-Republic, anti-Sukarno, he became Prime Minister, and here he is, smiling away as Sukarno was sitting there with his first visit to Australia. So political expediency, I suppose. And the next one, thanks Pete. Anyone recognise the guy in the middle? John Wayne. So after the Republic was declared, various VIPs went to visit Mr. Sukarno, including John Wayne. And who's this? Sheila. So she met Sir Edmund Hillary and all sorts of people. And finally, and this is not a plug for my book, but this photo was taken, it was in Tribune, and it was the first repatriation. And the fellow up the back there with the moustache, his name's Elliot V. Elliot. He was Federal Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia, and he presented a flag for these people to take back and give to Sukarno. But, now this is what you've all been waiting for, the word Pyrmont. This was Wharf 9, Pyrmont Bay, the first repatriation. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jan. Now we can take any questions. So is who's going to be the first questioner? This one of your ex-pupils.
Yeah, I've heard that. When did I teach you?
Yeah.
Selamat sore Bu Jan. Selamat ketemu. Yeah, it's good to see you again.
Siapa namanya?
Jeff.
Jeff.
Last time Jan and I were together would have been about 50 years ago at ANU. I was sitting down in the lecture theatre and she was out the front lecturing. So good to see you again. We haven't lost your touch.
Did you recognise me? That's the
You haven't changed. You haven't changed.
I must have looked old then.
Yeah, so Jan, I haven't got a question, just probably just a couple just comments. I was in Jakarta about 15 years ago. I was visiting the museum, Art Forces Museum, and an Indonesian came up to me and he assumed I was Dutch, and was being sort of very polite about being Dutch, as now actually I'm Australian. And for the first time, I spent a lot of time in Indonesia. It was the first time an Indonesian actually mentioned the fact that the black band, the Wharfies strike, over the 1940s, and the contribution Australia had made to Indonesian independence. So he just came straight out with that, and that was a nice little conversation we had. And the final little one on that flag, for those who don't know, that's red and white. The Dutch flag is red, white and blue. Yeah. And the reason the flag, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason it's red and white, they had to declare independence. I was in the what's now the Majapahit Hotel in Surabaya. The rebellion had just defeated the British, who had also come on behalf of the Dutch in a peace in trying to help the Dutch out. The independence leaders climbed to the top of the Majapahit Hotel in Surabaya. They needed a flag, they had a Dutch one, so they stripped off the blue and got the red white. So just a couple of comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
I might add that whenever there's a formal occasion with government level, with Indonesians and Australian politicians talking, there's always reference to this, our gratitude to Australia for what they did in the war. Sometimes I think it's inflated, but nevertheless it's become part of the formula when governments to government meet each other.
There were then a lot of people, Dutch people from Indonesia that actually then ended up in Australia.
Yes. And some of them stayed after the war.
A lot stayed.
Yes.
When I went to school, I had numerous school friends whose parents had come from Indonesia.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you knew too much about that. Was there only a few that stayed, or a lot, or how many actually did come? Because it just seemed that quite a
Dutch
few
people were here. I don't know. I think altogether during the war, it's been estimated that there were about 10,000 Indonesians here at different times, but I don't really know about how many Dutch people there were.
It seemed to be quite a lot. I mean, I grew up in Cronulla, and there were quite a lot in the Southern Shire. It was quite a big number.
I think some of them went home to after Indonesia became independent. Of course, those Dutch people, a lot of them went home, and then I think a lot of those people came back to Australia. But actually, after the war, I don't know. Sorry.
Can I just comment that I grew up in the Communist Party, and it was part of our proud heritage that communists were at the forefront of the support of Indonesians for independence. Elliot V. Elliot was a communist who was the head of the Seamen's Union, and Jim Healy was the head of the Wharfies Union, and the strength of the union movement at that time and the support of the Communist Party and, as Jan said, of the newspaper Tribune were really significant, I've been told, by my elders in developing that support for Indonesian independence, and I think we're very proud of that.
There was a wonderful old lady called Phyllis Johnson who was a very staunch communist, and when the merchant seamen left the Dutch ships, they had no sustenance. They had to be looked after. They had to be given accommodation, food, because they weren't getting any wages. And Phyllis Johnson used to go out to factories, various factories at lunchtime, and she would proselytise about the Indonesian, try and have whip-arounds to get funds to feed them. And the Indonesian word for freedom, independence, is merdeka. And she would go on trams, or she'd go to a dress there, she'd merdeka, merdeka. Lovely Aussie housewife communist was there.
With those people who had to do labour during the war, the ones that were released from places, were they paid?
They were paid a pittance, yes. Not very much, but yes, they were paid. But not as much as the Australians were.
Jan, what happened to John Wayne? He was a big supporter.
Oh, I don't know.
Where did Donald Trump from this?
I imagine that John Wayne would have had a clue.
I would like to ask a question. What was it like? Because I was in Jakarta in 1961 and it was a bomb site.
Yeah.
It was literally a bomb site. It was...
That's the aftermath of...
Yes, it was... The buildings were just... You know, the glass was broken. Anything that had Dutch or had anything to do with the Dutch, the Indonesians would have nothing to do with. So they let those buildings be destroyed. They just smashed the windows.
I think it's been rebuilt now.
But at that time, that must have meant that the Indonesian people were living very, it was a dreadful place to go.
Yeah, I think in more recent years, and I can't put a time frame on it, but I think the Dutch have acknowledged a lot of the atrocities that they carried out there against them. So there's been a sort of a sorry movement from the Dutch government. Yeah. But I have
Because the Indonesians at that point were very bitter. They were very, and if you were white, it was a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah. It's interesting. I didn't get there till 1972, so.
I wasn't there for very long. And interesting to take Mary's point, of course, after we arrived back in Melbourne and my parents made this comment, my grandfather was a Wharfie who had struck. And of course there was a very heated discussion across the Christmas table.
It's probably just, I think it's a fascinating part of our history that not too many of us know about. And if my Uncle Gordon hadn't told me about the camp in Wollongara where he befriended some of the Indonesians there because they came to him and he had chooks, and they would swap chooks for some things that due to wartime rationing he couldn't get, like a man's singlet. So swap a singlet for a chook. And you know, those Indonesians were running around these country towns, going to the movies, all sorts of things that all stopped.
Just an aside, which I hope is of interest, my father left Holland for various reasons, and one of them was he had 8 sons, and he really feared that they would get involved in the slaughter in Indonesia, that they would be conscripted, so he brought them to Australia instead.
Right.
By the way, the word you have difficulty with is pronounced oranje.
Thank you. That's true. So, yeah, the lady who was talking about how many Dutch people, here's one. Thank you. Duncan. Thank you. Is that right?
Well, thank you again, Jan. Just to re-echo Donald's comments about your energy and athleticism. And that jigging around and such. So on behalf of us all, thanks for your efforts.